The first thing the dock workers noticed was the smell. 12 ships had just pulled into the Sicilian port of Messina in the autumn of 1347, arriving from the Black Sea. The men on the docks moved toward the vessels to tie the ropes and unload the cargo, but when they looked aboard, they stopped. Most of the sailors were already dead. The ones still breathing were covered in dark swellings the size of eggs, clustered under their arms and along their necks. The swellings were black and leaking blood and pus. The skin around them had turned a bruised, terrible color. The Sicilian authorities panicked. They ordered every ship out of the harbor immediately. But the decision came too late. The disease had already stepped off those ships and into the city. Within days, people in Messina started dying. The sickness moved through families like fire through dry wood. A person could feel fine in the morning and be dead before the week was over. The swellings would appear first. Then came the fever, the vomiting, the pain in every part of the body. And then silence. One Italian writer at the time described it simply. He said people ate lunch with their friends and ate dinner with their ancestors in the afterlife. That is how fast it killed. I came across that detail recently in my research, and it stopped me. The authorities saw the danger. They gave the order to push the ships away, and none of it mattered. The disease could cross a harbor faster than any command could travel from a governor's mouth to a soldier's hand. Within weeks, Messina was overwhelmed, and those ships that were turned away did not disappear. They drifted to other ports, looking for safe harbor, and everywhere they docked, the dying began again. To understand where those ships came from, you have to go further east to the edge of the Black Sea. A port city called Kaffa sat on the coast of Crimea. It was a Genoese trading post, one of the most important commercial outposts connecting Europe to Asia. And in 1346, it was under siege. A Mongol army led by a commander named Janibeg had surrounded the city. His soldiers were dying, not from battle, but from a disease that had been spreading through Central Asia for years. Janibeg could not take the city by force, so he tried something else. He loaded the bodies of his dead soldiers, men already blackened and swollen with the sickness, onto catapults and launched them over the walls of Kaffa. The corpses landed inside the city, and the disease followed. The Genoese traders inside Kaffa watched the sickness begin to spread among their own people. They knew they had to leave. They boarded their ships and sailed west across the Black Sea. The first major stop was Constantinople, the largest city in the Eastern world. The plague hit it hard. It killed the 13-year-old son of the Byzantine emperor. From Constantinople, the ships continued west. They carried goods meant for trade, silk, spices, grain. But packed inside those ships, hidden in the cargo holds and the dark spaces below deck, were rats, and living on the rats were fleas. And living inside the fleas was the disease. That is how it traveled. Not through curses or bad air, the way people at the time believed. It moved through tiny creatures that no one thought to look at. The fleas fed on the rats. When the rats died, the fleas jumped to the nearest warm body, human or animal, and with every bite, the sickness spread. One detail from my research that I find remarkable is that the trail actually begins almost a decade before those ships reached Europe. Near a lake called Kul, deep in Central Asia, there are old burial sites with tombstones carved in the late 1330s. The inscriptions on some of those graves list the cause of death as pestilence. The bones in those graves have been tested, and the same disease was found inside them. The trail of the plague was already being carved into stone years before Europe knew anything was coming. The plague moved the same way money moved. It followed the trade routes. Every road that carried merchants, every port that welcomed cargo ships, every city connected to the web of European commerce became a target. And the richer the connection between two cities, the faster the plague traveled between them. It reached mainland Italy first. Florence, one of the wealthiest and most crowded cities in all of Europe, was struck with a violence that still almost defies belief. The city held roughly 85,000 people before the plague arrived. By the time the first wave passed, around 50,000 of them were dead. More than half the city, gone in a matter of months. From Italy, the sickness spread to the ports of southern France. Marseille was hit. Then it reached Rome. By the middle of 1348, it was in Paris, Bordeaux, Lyon, and London. Paris, at its worst, was burying 800 bodies a day. You walk through a city like that, and the streets are different. Carts roll past carrying the dead stacked like timber. Houses stand open with no one inside. Dogs wander without owners. Cattle drift into villages with no farmers to guide them. Crops sit in the fields rotting because there are no hands left to bring in the harvest. The smell is something you carry with you long after you leave. A ship from the French coast carried the disease to the southern coast of England in 1348, landing at a small port in Dorset. It reached Bristol almost immediately. By February of 1349, London was consumed. The worst months lasted through May. Some estimates say London's population fell from 100,000 to just 20,000 in a single generation. In the crowded cities, the disease found the perfect conditions. Poor sanitation, narrow streets, families packed into tight rooms, rats in the walls. And in these conditions, the sickness changed. A second form of the plague attacked the lungs and spread through the air itself. A cough, a breath, and the person next to you was infected. That form killed everyone who caught it. One thing that caught my attention is that some places managed to escape. Milan, one of the great cities of Italy, survived almost untouched. Some towns that sealed their gates early and refused all contact with the outside world made it through. The ones that kept their doors open, the ones that kept trading, those were the ones that died. The disease did not care about wealth or power or faith, but it respected a closed door. Inside the monasteries, the death was staggering. Monks lived close together, ate together, and prayed together. When the plague entered a monastery, it swept through like wind through an open corridor. It is estimated that half the monks in England died. Priests who went to care for the sick and offer last prayers were among the most likely to be infected. So many clergy died that there were simply not enough left to perform the rituals. The Pope himself was forced to grant forgiveness of sins to everyone who died of the plague, because there was no one left to hear their confessions. People were told they could confess to each other. Even to a woman, the decree said, which in that world told you everything about how desperate things had become. By 1349, the plague had reached into nearly every corner of Western Europe, and the places it hit hardest were not just cities, they were entire communities, entire ways of life. In England, some villages saw 80 or 90 out of every 100 people die, not a figure on a page, families, neighbors, everyone a person had ever known. You stand in a village like that after the sickness passes, and there is almost no one left to stand with you. The fields are empty. The animals have scattered or starved. The church is quiet. The houses are still there, but the people who built them are buried behind them in shallow graves, sometimes in pits where dozens of bodies were dropped together because there was no time and no one left to dig proper ground for each of them. Across Europe, the grief twisted into something darker. People needed someone to blame, and the blame fell on the Jews. In city after city, rumors spread that Jews had poisoned the drinking wells. Mobs formed. Thousands of Jews were dragged from their homes, beaten, burned alive. Entire communities were destroyed, not by the plague itself, but by the fear and hatred the plague set loose. Others turned their fury inward. Groups of men marched from town to town, stripped to the waist, beating themselves with leather straps fitted with sharp metal pieces. They believed the plague was punishment from God, and that only pain and blood could earn forgiveness. They did this 3 times a day, for weeks on end, while townspeople gathered and watched. Something I find worth noting is that the people who fled the infected cities, trying to save their own lives, often made things worse. They carried the disease with them to places that had not yet been touched. A family running from death in one town delivered it to the next. The instinct to survive became the very thing that spread the killing further. The church, which for centuries had been the one thing people trusted above all else, began to crack. Priests had died alongside peasants. Prayers had not stopped the sickness. The same God who was supposed to protect the faithful had struck them down no differently than anyone else. For the common people, this planted something new. Not just grief, but doubt. If the church could not explain this, if God could not stop it, then maybe the people at the top of the world were not so different from the people at the bottom. That thought, quiet as it was, would grow louder in the years to come. The first great wave of the plague began to slow around 1351. It did not vanish. It lingered in pockets, and it would return in smaller waves over the following decades, striking again in the early 1360s and again in the late 1360s. But the worst of the passage was over. What it left behind was a silence that spread across the continent like a second plague. An estimated 25 million people in Europe were dead. Some counts push that number much higher. The population of the continent would not return to what it had been before 1347 for roughly 200 years. In England alone, more than 1,300 villages were abandoned between 1350 and 1500, not destroyed by armies, not burned, simply emptied. The people who had lived there were gone, and no one came to take their place. But inside that silence, something shifted. With so many dead, there were far fewer hands to work the fields, to tend the animals, to build, to harvest. And for the first time in generations, the people at the bottom of the world, the peasants who had been tied to the land, forced to work for nothing, forbidden to leave without permission, suddenly had something they had never had before: power. Their labor was needed, and because it was needed, it had value. Landowners who had once treated peasants as property now had to offer wages. They had to compete for workers. Taxes dropped because there were fewer people to tax. The price of food fell because there were fewer mouths to feed. Peasants began to demand better conditions. Some could choose where to work. Some could negotiate their own terms. The old system, the rigid structure that had kept the poor locked in place for 300 years, was beginning to break apart. One detail I find remarkable is what the survivors inherited. It was not just land or coin. With so many dead, there was suddenly more of everything to go around. More tools, more animals, more grain stores, more space. The people who made it through the plague did not just survive. They stepped into a world that, for all its emptiness, offered them something it never had before. In England, the government tried to stop it. A law was passed in 1351 that said no worker could demand higher wages than what had been paid before the plague. It did not work. The resentment it caused would build for decades, feeding an anger that would eventually break into open revolt. The church tried to rebuild, but the priests who replaced the dead were often poorly trained and rushed into service. Congregations were smaller. Faith was quieter. The hold the church had once kept over every part of daily life had loosened, and it would never fully tighten again. And the art that came after the plague was different. It showed death not as something distant or sacred, but as something standing right beside you. Skeletons dancing alongside kings and peasants. Paintings of graveyards and rotting bodies. The people who lived through those years had seen something that changed the way they understood the world, and they put that understanding into everything they made. This is Kyle, and I want to ask you something. If the plague had reached your gate, if you had heard the rumors and seen the ships on the horizon, would you have sealed the door and turned everyone away, or would you have kept it open?